I would like to introduce Professor Eric Louw, and I'll allow Eric to give us a bit of background of his own. Thank you, Eric.
Good. Okay. Radio. Okay. Right, I have to say that when Grant asked me to do this talk, I had absolutely no idea just how much help South Africa gave to the Rhodesians. Okay, now the South African help to Rhodesia happened under two National Party leaders, namely B.J. Vorster and PW Bhorta. And these two guys differed in terms of both their political plans and their political styles. And as you'll see, these differences impacted on Rhodesia. As you'll discover from my two talks, there was much more help given by Bhorta. Bhorta gave much more help to the Rhodesians than did Vorster. In fact, the second talk that I'm going to give looks at the Bhorta thing, and it's just exponential how it goes mad, basically. But even Vorster, which is what we're going to talk about today, even he gave a lot of help to the Rhodesians. So today we're going to then focus on B.J. Vorster's policies toward Rhodesia. Now, it's worth noting that Vorster was chosen as Prime Minister because he was seen to be a hardline guy who was going to implement Verwoestian apartheid. But as it turned out, he was a conciliator. He preferred negotiations and compromise to conflict. Vorster just didn't like conflict. And that meant, ultimately, that Vorster failed to implement Verwoestian apartheid. And so eventually, because of this, the National Party pushed him out as Prime Minister in disgrace, because he was a failure. Now at this point, just bear with me for a bit. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just explaining Vorster's policies. Basically, if you understand National Party policies, it also helps you understand sort of South African thinking about the Rhodesians. So it impacts on why they do the stuff that they do. Okay, so what was the policy that Vorster failed to implement that got him into trouble with his own party? Well, it was Verwoestian apartheid. Now, I'm not interested in whether it was a good idea or a bad idea or whatever. I'm simply interested in what the Nats thought they were doing, okay? And what it's important to understand is that the policy of apartheid differed quite dramatically from what the Rhodesians were going to do. So the South Africans never saw the Rhodesians as doing the same thing as them. Now, to understand the difference between what the South Africans were doing apartheid, right? The Rhodesians were doing segregation. Now, this is important because it influences politicians like Vorster. It impacts on the way he thinks about Rhodesia. It also impacts, this is more important in fact, it also impacts on the way these guys, both Bhorta and Vorster, it impacts on the way they think about how they might or they might not have Rhodesia fit into their plans. Okay? Now, Verwoestian apartheid, as the name suggests, was invented by a dude called Hendrik Verwoerd. Okay, let's go on. So, this dude. Righto. Now, something that's not very well known, and I'm sure it's going to surprise a lot of people in the room here, is that Verwoerd was a Rhodesian lad. His father was a missionary near Bulawayo. And so Verwoerd grew up near Bulawayo, and he went to school at Milton. There you go. Okay. Now what we need to recognize is that the Nats invented, Verwoerd invents apartheid as an alternative to segregation. And this is because segregation is the policy of Jan Smuts' United Party. And of course the Nats fight, in 1948 they fight an election against the United Party, and it's about, do we have segregation or do we have apartheid? These are not the same things. Significantly, segregation is also the policy of the Rhodesian Front, of Ian Smith's party. Okay? Now, the link between the United Party in South Africa and the Rhodesia Front is that they're both drawing upon exactly the same British Empire roots. Okay? Segregation is a policy invented by the British. The British invent segregation. And they invent segregation as a way to solve a British Empire problem. And the problem they're trying to solve is that how do you govern an empire that throws races together? That's what the British Empire does, on a massive scale. How do you govern all these races that are different from each other? Now, effectively, segregation is designed to bring together, okay, so it's designed to actually bring together different races within the same state and within the same economy. So they bring them together. So you come together during the day to work together, but at night you go back to your own separate social worlds. So you're together for half of the day, but then at other part of times you go separate. That's segregation, right? Right, so you have separate social worlds, basically. Now, Frevodian apartheid, Verwoerd says that their complaint about segregation was that they said it only represented partial separation. It was a partial separation, because you only separated for part of the time. And further, they argue that it's about, they say it's unsustainable. The National Party look at segregation, whether it was Smuts' version or the Rhodesian Front's version, and they say this is politically unsustainable because you can't put people together in the same workplace and the same state, but then exclude them from politics while you're doing this. They're going to get pissed off at you, basically. All right. So the National Party now comes up with this alternative, this new plan. That's an alternative to partial segregation, remember? And what they do is they come up with a plan for full partition. Full partition is a very different thing. So, what is the National Party suggesting doing? What is Verwoerd telling them to do? He's saying that the National Party must take over the British-made state. Remember, South Africa as a state is made by the British. The British draw the boundaries of that country. They invent the governance of the country. They invent the economy. It's basically a British-made state. National Party, Verwoerd says, we've got to win an election and take over this British-made state and then break it up. Break up the state into 11 separate independent ethnic states. That's kind of quite a radical idea, to break up your own state. Okay? And they say they want to do this because they argue that the British have thrown together people who don't belong together. They want to get them apart. Right? So what's the plan that Verwoerd comes up with? He says, blacks are going to get the vote. Because everybody in the world wants black guys to get the vote. He says, yeah, I'm going to give them the vote. Black guys are going to get the vote, but they're going to get the vote in their own 10 separate black states. Not in white South Africa, in their own countries. And here's the trick. Once each of those states gets given its independence, black guys cease to be citizens of South Africa. They're now citizens of another country. And if they're citizens of another country, right, eventually you're going to end up with South Africa having a white demographic majority. It just by default becomes a white country. That's the solution to the problem. All right. So, Verwoerd's plan is to create a white state in Africa by decolonizing black guys into some other state somewhere else. It's kind of a cunning idea, right? However, now here comes the rub. Okay. For this plan to work, you've got to create 10 viable black states. They've got to be viable states. Now the problem is, Vorster, as I've explained, has a particular style. And Vorster's style is all about compromise and negotiating, and he dithers around a lot. Okay? Now this compromising, negotiating, dithering style he has two political consequences. Right here. Okay. Now the internal consequence of Vorster's dithering, okay, is that he eventually gets shafted by his own party, by the National Party. And in fact, it was PW Bhorta's faction that shafted him. So PW Bhorta shafts Vorster. And Bhorta, when he comes in with a whole new plan. He comes in with a plan, he says, I'm going to reform apartheid. I'm going to create a new policy now. something else that we didn't have before. So he's coming in with a whole new plan. The external consequences of Vorster's style of compromise and stuff was his policy of détente. And of course the Rhodesians know all about détente because Vorster imposes détente on Rhodesia, right? So détente, you can see, grows out of compromise, grows out of that style of politics. Okay, now are we going to come back to the détente stuff later and discuss what that's all about? Now, if we look at PW Bhorta, the guy that shafts him, now Bhorta, I'm really going to spend much time about, Bhorta's going to be looked at in the second talk, not this one, but we're going to cover some of Bhorta now because you'll see he plays a role here as well. Now, PW Bhorta is a very, very different kind of fellow to Vorster. Curiously, in the Anglo world, Bhorta is seen to be a hard-line conservative. Whereas inside the National Party, Bhorta is seen to be a reformer, a guy who makes change, just the opposite of the way Anglos see him. Now the point is, Bhorta is a reformer, but not a conciliator. Okay? So he has a plan, it's a reform plan. Once he's got his reform plan, he doesn't budge. Instead, he's a guy who stands his ground. Now essentially what happens is this. Bhorta has concluded, okay, he concludes that Vorster has made a mess of things. Okay? And he's made a mess of things because he hasn't implemented Verwoestian apartheid as according to the plan. Worse, Bhorta and his faction say it can no longer be implemented. It's too late. You wasted 10 years in not doing this. Those were crucial years. Those are the years when we had the power to do it. Now it's slipping away from us. We can't do this anymore. Okay? So he's saying, well, since we can't implement apartheid according to the original plan, we've got to come up with something new. He calls it a radical survival plan for white guys. Like, how do white guys save themselves if the old plan's not going to work anymore? And he comes up with a reformed apartheid model. It's a reformed apartheid that he invents. Okay. Now, the fact that Bhorta brings with him this reformed model is very significant because his new reform model impacts not only on what he wants to do in South Africa and in Southwest Africa. Now, obviously, his models, South African government policy, directly applies to South Africa, also directly applies to Southwest Africa. But in fact, in the case of PW Bhorta, it also impacts on his plans for Rhodesia. His new model can fit Rhodesia. Okay? So in short, it impacts on the way he's going to, on the kind of help he's going to give Rhodesia and how much help he's going to give Rhodesia. Because Rhodesia now becomes of interest to PW Bhorta. Now, so what's important for us, in both the talks that we're going to look at, is that whereas Vorster was a guy who caved into the Pax Americana, okay, Vorster always wanted to please the Americans. He caved into the American empire, did what they wanted. Bhorta was not a guy who caved into the Americans. In fact, he spent much of his time telling the Americans to go to hell. Okay? He really annoyed the Americans a lot as a consequence. Okay, so we'll come back to Bhorta's reformed apartheid and his plans for South African Rhodesia when I do my second talk, not now, right? But what is important for you guys to remember now is that for both Vorster and for Bhorta, when they think about Rhodesia, okay, and when they think about the Rhodesian model of segregation, they are thinking that the Rhodesian model is unsustainable in the long run. Okay, they don't think this is a plan that can, a form of government that can survive. Okay, so now let's turn to Vorster's period, specifically. Okay. Okay. Now, when we look at Vorster, we see that there are two different periods. Sorry? Yep.
Sorry, just for context.
Yep.
Can you just remind me once again the years?
The years.
Of Vorster.
Okay. Okay. So Vorster's there from the mid 60s,
Yeah.
66, and he gets shafted in 78. Okay, and Bhorta comes. Although I'll argue that actually he gets shafted a bit before then. He's a lame duck long before he actually gets shafted. And in fact, part of what we're going to look at today, you'll see some blurring because PW Bhorta is already starting to call the shots, and you start to see already the Rhodesians start to get a hell of a lot more. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Now, if we're looking at the Vorster period, okay. The Vorster period itself can be divided into two sections, two completely different periods. The first period is before the Portuguese coup, and the second period is after the Portuguese coup d'etat. Okay. So now let's look at the before the coup period, and that's where this map comes in. Okay. Now, what Foster was trying to do, okay, before the coup d'etat, so now this is, as you said, a period that could be from 60, 65, 66, okay, until 74, that period. What Foster is trying to do is that. It's his defense bloc. Foster is trying to create a defensive bloc for Southern Africa. He's not just thinking of South Africa, he's thinking of the whole of Southern Africa all along. And that's his defensive bloc. Now, if we look at that map, what you see is this. Foster looks at Southern Africa and he goes, there are 4 areas of white settlement in Southern Africa that he wants to protect. And what are they? Well, obviously South Africa is the main area he's interested in. He's also interested in Southwest Africa. He's also interested in Rhodesia. But he's also, the 4th one is, he's interested in Mozambique south of the Zambezi, which is where the Portuguese are settled. And he goes, south of the Zambezi is also a white settlement area. We can protect that as well. All right? So, that's his core areas that he's trying to protect. The method he wants, that he has in mind to do that is, and this is a core part of South African strategic thinking right through both Foster and in fact for Bhorta. Both of them want to keep the war as far north as you can get it. So the plan is, if your white guys are settled south of the Zambezi there, fight your wars north of the Zambezi. Don't fight your wars on the land where white guys live. Keep the war away from white guys. So white guys don't have, the war should, if you get it right, the war should not impact on white guys. So the defensive line is where the little crosses along the Zambezi. That's his defensive line. Foster goes, I'm holding the line at the Zambezi. That's what I'm interested in. Anything south of the Zambezi, I want to hold it. Okay, that's my tripwire. Okay. So, if you look at the map, you will see that he succeeds. The areas that I've marked in orange, okay, these are where the wars, actually the really serious wars, were fought under Foster. They were all fought on Portuguese land. So you had the war against Frelimo, you had the war against the FNLA, the MPLA, and UNITA, all north of the line. He holds the wars to the north, and there's some really serious wars going on there. Okay? But south of the line, there's just not a lot going on. If you're a white guy in that part south, there's not, do you think everything is cool now? Okay, so he's actually getting it right. Okay. In order to do this, now is when Bhorta does come into the story. It turns out that during Foster's premiership, PW Bhorta is the defense minister anyway. So in fact, PW Bhorta is the guy who's given the job of putting that into place. So Foster goes, we're building a defensive bloc for Southern Africa, you're the defense minister, go do it. Right? And the way Bhorta does this is that he creates a defensive alliance called ALCORA. Okay? And ALCORA starts as an alliance, as a military alliance between South Africa and Portugal. So now we have to say, what is ALCORA defending against? When Foster and Bhorta are thinking, what are they defending us against through this alliance? All of it's marked in yellow are the states inside ALCORA. So it starts as a South African-Portuguese alliance, and then later on the South Africans bring the Rhodesians in. So you have the 3 governments as part of the same military alliance. Okay? So what are they defending against? Well, they're defending against a group of Soviet-aligned liberation movements. Okay? The Soviets create some surrogate political players. That was what they did in the Cold War. Both sides did this. They create surrogate players who are going to fight their wars for them. If you're fighting a Cold War with nuclear weapons, you can't actually kill each other directly. So you set up surrogate players who do the fighting for you. So the Soviet Union sets up surrogate players who are going to fight their wars for them in Southern Africa and in Africa. Now let's look at the list of players with the Soviet Union's surrogate players. Okay. The first is the ANC in South Africa, is Soviet aligned. ZAPU in Rhodesia is Soviet aligned. The MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, the PAIGC, who are fighting further up in Portuguese Guinea, and believe it or not, there's even a kind of neo-Australian connection here. Fretilin are fighting the Portuguese in Timor, which is not that far away from Darwin. Fretilin are also part of this group of surrogate players. Now the point about the Soviets is when they create these groups, okay, so the Soviet Union has created them, it funds them, it trains them, it arms them. They are like runners, Soviet proxies. Okay? Significantly, they trained together. All these forces are trained together. And the Soviets want them to work together. They want them to operate as a single interoperable unit. They must be able to interchange with each other. So they train them together. They think of themselves as comrades. They're all on the same team. Okay? And in fact, the Soviet Union, as we'll see, pushes them into collaboration, tries really hard to get them to collaborate with each other. Okay. Now, it was under Vorster, so this is not in the Vorster period, right? It's under Vorster that South Africa starts to help the Rhodesians. Okay? And they give the Rhodesians a lot of help. Okay? Much more than I never realized how much help they gave the Rhodesians. Okay? But here's the thing. Under Vorster, when the help is given to the Rhodesians, it's kept under wraps. It's secret. Vorster doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want this to come out. So he gives a lot of stuff to the Rhodesians, but he doesn't want anybody to talk about this stuff. Now, we have to say, well, why is Pretoria so keen on keeping everything under wraps? Why do they want this all secret? Okay, well, the main reason is the South Africans don't want to upset Britain. And we're going to see why they don't want to upset Britain now. So the first thing is, of course, at this stage, Rhodesia is still technically a British colony. This is their territory. I mean, Rhodesians have declared UDI, but no one else in the world recognizes this. And so the South Africans don't want to upset the Brits too much. They're kind of going, yeah, we know it's yours. It's your colony. It's all good. We don't support these rebel dudes. Okay, we're on your team. But you know, so you get the idea. So that was the one reason, obviously. But there's another reason. Okay, and the second reason, in fact, maybe was even more important, was that Pretoria by this stage was already coming under very serious pressure from the Americans. The Pax Americana, the American empire, is leaning on Pretoria very, very hard. We have to understand why America is leaning on them. What are they doing? Okay.
Harry,
Yep.
quick question.
Yep.
Didn't the British break in 1965 the declaration of UDI? That's when the Rhodesians said goodbye to England.
Yes, but so the Rhodesians regard themselves as not British. Now it's a UDI. But the British don't regard them as, the British continue to say, this is ours. We don't recognize your independence. And there was not a single country in the world recognized that independence, not even South Africa. No country recognized that independence. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, Rhodesia remained British territory. And that's why at the end, when they had the election in 1980, the Brits came back. They said, well, it's always been ours. Legally, it's always been ours. You guys are just a bunch of rebels, you're crazy people. Okay? Okay. And that's why they didn't want to upset the Brits on those lines, okay? Okay, now we get back to the American Empire stuff. Okay. Now you have to remember that what the Second World War does, I'm going back a bit now, but it's important. You'll see why this is important. The Second World War transfers power from the British Empire to the American Empire. The Second World War, in the Second World War, the German Empire and the Japanese Empire were defeated. So was the British Empire. The British Empire goes down, and it's deliberate. It's not accident. All right? And when the Americans come to, so from 1945, the Americans take over the world, basically. They transfer power from London to Washington. When this shift happens, there are two things that the Americans push. They push it really, really hard. The one is decolonization. And the second is, so decolonization is because the Americans want all European empires to be closed down. And they push this hard. All European empires, including the British Empire, have to be shut down. That's their policy. Secondly, when you give independence to these colonies, when you shut down your empires, the Americans insist that the new states that are created have to be run as one person, one vote democracies on American lines. They want American-style democracy in all these places. So, decolonization, democratization are core American policies which they're imposing on the world after 1945, okay? And they're imposing it on Britain as well. Now, if we're going to understand that, as to how come this happens, it actually goes back to the early 1940s. Before America even goes into the war, into the Second World War, this is Roosevelt's policy. This is what he wants to do. And he sets up, in 1940, Roosevelt sets up 4 secret committees. They were secret at the time. Now you can just go to the archives and pull their minutes and see what these guys said. But there were 4 secret committees inside the State Department set up by Roosevelt And the job of these 4 committees was, how do we destroy the British Empire? That was the question. That's our enemy. How do we make them go away? Okay? Now, why would the Americans want to do that? Well, if you look at... Oh, what happened there?
That's really well.
Right, okay. All right, now, 1940, they set up these committees, right? Why do they do that? Okay, America became a powerful country, economically powerful, if you like, because economics is what drives your power. America becomes powerful roughly about 1900. It's a little bit like what you see with China now. China has now become powerful, economically powerful, and they're powerful enough now to say to the Americans, bugger off. When the Americans tell the Chinese to do something, they say, no, I'm not going to do what you want, bugger off. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1900. The Americans reached the point when they could say to the Brits, bugger off. Okay? So from 1900 onwards, America is now this powerful new muscular state. You see China trying to build their empire now. That's what, and of course the Americans get in the way, right? Well, that was going on in 1900 as well. When the Americans go out trying to build their empire, because they're powerful enough to build an empire now, guess what happens? Every time they go out into the world, between the First World War and the Second World War, if you like, every time they go out into the world and they get to a place, the Brits are there. Because the Brits are bloody good at this. They always get the best bits. They literally grab every bit of the world that was worth having. So every time the Americans arrive, so there's going to be some pommy guy there going, I say, old chap, bugger off. This is mine. And the Americans were furious. They were outraged. Wherever they went, the bloody Brits were there first. And so Roosevelt says, those guys have got to go. This is getting in our way. We're big and powerful, and we want to go out and do our thing. We want to trade with the world, and they've got tariff barriers up all over the place. They're blocking it. This has got to go. So that's why they set up these committees, to make the empire go away, okay? So it's because the Brits are in the way of American expansion. So of course, we guys in South Africa and Rhodesia, I think we've always made the mistake. Whenever somebody uses the word decolonization, we think that some Afro-Asian dude has thought this up, or we think the Soviets thought it up. No, it was the Americans who thought it up. Decolonization was an American idea. Okay, they were the guys who pushed this. Okay. Now, there's actually a moment in time when this all becomes really important, and it's in 1941. Okay, when when Churchill agrees to something called the Atlantic Charter. Okay, this is an absolutely seminal moment for us. It's crucial. Now, what happens is this: 1941. America's not in the war yet. So the Brits are now fighting the Germans. And in 1941, the Brits are losing badly. The Germans are winning the war in 1941. In fact, if anybody asks you, the Germans are going to nail the Brits soon. The Brits are in deep, deep trouble in 1941. Everybody thinks they're about to lose. So Roosevelt and Churchill have a meeting. Churchill asked for a meeting with the Americans, like, dude, you've got to come and help us here. This is really bad. Okay, they have a meeting. They meet on battleships off the coast of Canada. And at this meeting, basically what's happening is that Churchill says to the Americans, you've got to come help us. We're going to lose the war. And in fact, Roosevelt says, yeah, I know you're going to lose the war. You're definitely going to lose the war. And tough shits. We're going to let you guys go down. You started it, we didn't do it. We're going to let you go down. But we'll come and help you on a couple of conditions here. And the condition is decolonization. At the end of the war, you shut down your empire. Okay? And because this conflict between America and Britain has been going on for a while. I mean, the Americans have been telling the Brits to do this for a while now. And all of Churchill's advisors are saying, do not agree. They call this the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was the document. And all of Churchill's advisors are saying to him, do not agree to the Atlantic Charter under any circumstances. Never agree to this. If you agree to that document, you're shutting down the empire in 1945. You realize that. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Never agree to this. Anyway, Roosevelt stands his ground. And he goes, well, look, dude, you've got a choice here. You can be a German colony, okay, or you can sign the Atlantic Charter. That's your choice. As soon as you agree to the Atlantic Charter, we come help you. We give you land-lease, probably get into the war, it's all good. Yeah? But not until then. And Churchill agrees. So from 1941, when Churchill agrees to the Atlantic Charter, for us guys in Africa, us white guys, we're done. It's all over. There's no going back after that. This was going to happen. All right? Okay, but now when the power actually transfers, so in 1945, power is literally transferred from London to Washington. All right? And the Pax Americana starts to build itself up as a new empire, an alternative to the British Empire. Now, within this empire, here's the interesting part. Within this empire, the British are made deputy sheriff. If you look at the Americans, when they nailed all the empires, so when they nailed the French and they nailed the Belgians and they nailed the Portuguese, all these guys, okay? But with them, they don't give them anything in return. They just go, it's over, shut, boom. But with the Brits, it's their cousins, and they go, oh, okay. Tell you what, dudes, we'll make you the deputy sheriff. And so the British become America's deputy sheriff in the new empire, which is quite a big thing, okay? Okay, now Foster knows this. Foster knows that the British are America's deputy sheriff. Now this becomes important in terms of the policies that he's adopting about Rhodesia. All right, why? Well, it turns out that London are much more open to the South Africans than the British. Than the Americans. The Americans are hard-ass, they're hardline. So when America talks to Pretoria, they're saying to them, look, this apartheid stuff doesn't conform to our idea of democracy. It's got to go away now, right now, just make it go away. Just as they were saying, Rhodesia's got to go, South Africa's got to be given independence, and the Portuguese Empire's got to shut down. All this has got to change, guys. But in the case of South Africa, they're saying, this apartheid thing doesn't conform to our idea of democracy. We don't like it. It's got to go. Okay, and they're just really hard-assed about it. The Brits, on the other hand, are much more amenable. The Brits have been in Africa. They understand Africa. They've been there a while. There's problems. So the British are saying to the Americans, dudes, back off. Back off on these guys. Give them a break. We've been in Africa. We know how hard this is. Africa's a rough place to govern, dude. Now, we know that you want decolonization. We know that you want democracy. But you can't just expect them to flick a light switch and put it on like that. That's what you guys want. It's unreasonable. Give them a break. Give them some time. Okay? And it seems that if you look at the documents that I've read, it's hard to find what time was involved here. If you look at if you look at American documents, they seem to be, eventually they were persuaded to give the British Empire about 30 years. If you look at the British documents, they think they were given a century. Okay, whatever. But they were given time to kind of develop black guys, to teach black guys how to be democratic and run a democratic government, to teach black guys how to run an economy, all that stuff. The Brits persuade the Americans, back off a bit, give them some time to do this stuff. All right? And so clearly, if you're in Pretoria and you're negotiating with anybody, you're going to be much more keen to negotiate with the Brits than negotiate with Washington directly. So Pretoria tried to route all its negotiations through London because the Brits could get the Americans to pull back a bit. And of course, for Rhodesia, that's a big deal because then they don't want to annoy the Brits. That's why, okay, it's your territory. We understand it's your colony. Okay, so they keep everything secret that they're giving the Rhodesians. Okay. Okay. Now, we're going to start looking just now at the sequence of events as Pretoria starts to get involved to help Rhodesia, okay? But before we do that, I thought it would be helpful to just give you a list. I think you've got it on the table as well. There's a list there of all the help that Foster gave, because even though Foster doesn't give the Rhodesians anything approaching the help that PW Bhorta gives, Foster still gives a lot of help. That's the list of stuff Foster gives to the Rhodesians. So we'll just run through that quickly so you get an idea of how much help was given. Okay, so the first thing is, under Foster, the police are deployed to Rhodesia, and they're deployed along the Zambezi, right? The second help is financial help. The South Africans gave the Rhodesians enormous amounts of financial help. In fact, over the course of the whole war, the South Africans paid for slightly more than 50% of the war. That's a lot of money. Okay, so they paid for all those guns and bullets and stuff. But in addition to financing the actual war, the other thing the South Africans gave the Rhodesians is, okay, this is sanctions. As soon as they declare UDI, sanctions are applied. Sanctions devastate economies. They terrible things. They really hurt, cost lots of money. The Rhodesian economy was in big trouble. The Brits knew how to hurt the Rhodesian economy, and they did. The South Africans came and bailed them out. They gave them lots of money. They gave them massive credit lines. They gave them money to keep the economy going, basically. The third thing the South Africans gave the Rhodesians is skilled people. Now, if you go back to the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, okay, there's not a lot of Rhodesians. Okay, there's not many of us. There's like 250,000 of us. Not enough skilled Rhodesians to run a country, literally. Just didn't have the skills, didn't have enough managers to run something like the Federation. There were not enough managers both in the government and in the private sector to run the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland. So during the British Empire period, the Brits were seconding people to Salisbury in large numbers, in the government service and also in the private sector. Many Brits came out there, they were seconded out there to run the economy and run the government. As soon as Rhodesia declares the UDI, those guys just go home. Boom. You just chop off all the leadership and just take all these managers away. And Rhodesia didn't have anybody to replace them with. Well, the South Africans replaced them. That was a major amount of help. South Africa just seconded its people up there to fill up all those spaces. And one of the main places that they did this was, in fact, in the Reserve Bank. Because the Reserve Bank is what keeps the economy going. And effectively, in 1965, after the Brits go, Rhodesia doesn't have a Reserve Bank anymore. And South Africa sent all of its economists from Pretoria up there to the Reserve Bank in Salisbury. I mean, basically, the Rhodesian Reserve Bank became a branch office of the South African Reserve Bank for all intents and purposes. It was their guys, okay? And they ran the economy in that way and kept it going, okay? And together with this came this credit line that came through the Reserve Bank. Money can just be transferred in so that the Brits couldn't bring the Rhodesian economy down. The fourth thing the South Africans supplied, of course, was weapons and ammunition. So they got Rhodesians, whatever you want, you got it. Okay? Although they negotiated with the Rhodesian that the deal was 50-50 initially. It was like, you pay 50%, you pay 50%. Well, whatever you want, you got it. We'll send it. Okay? The fifth help they gave, Alouette helicopters. Okay? And they didn't just send Alouette helicopters, but they also sent the air crews. These were South African pilots flying those helicopters. And also ground maintenance crews. Very hard keeping helicopters in the sky. South African ground crews came in to keep those helicopters up there. And they also supplied the Rhodesians with spotter planes. Because South Africans understand if you're going to fight a guerrilla war, you've got to control the sky. You've got to have these things. And Rhodesia didn't have them in 1965. The sixth thing they supplied was fuel. I mean, the British sanctions deliberately target fuel. They understand you cut the fuel, it's all gone. Now, South Africa supplies Rhodesia with as much fuel as it wants. And of course, they supplied from Sasol. So South Africa is making its own fuel from coal in Sasol. The world has no idea how much fuel South Africa is making. They can keep it all secret. They don't even have to import the stuff from anywhere else. They were just supplying Rhodesia straight out of Sasol, totally secret. The world had no idea how much fuel was going out there. The seventh thing they did was the South Africans sent up to Rhodesia an electronic warfare unit and some really good code breakers. Because if you're going to fight a war, you better know what the hell is going on in Zambia. Okay? South Africa also trained many people. They all understood there was a war coming, okay? And the Rhodesians, as I said, didn't have these skills. You had to give them the skills. So South Africa started a major training program, which went on right until the end of the war, actually. They trained Rhodesian pilots, Rhodesian navigators, aircraft maintenance people, paratroopers, all any skills like that. The Rhodesians would go down to South Africa and get trained and brought back. Ninth, the South Africans built 5 military airfields for the Rhodesians. And if you look at where they were positioned, it was along the Mozambique border, basically. South Africa built the Rutenga rail line, obviously easier to get the stuff up there. And then 11th, they shared intelligence. And sharing intelligence is really, really very important in warfare. It's absolutely central to what's going to happen. So it's worth, and the way they share intelligence is through this ALCORA thing I was telling you about. So ALCORA is the defense pact that PW Bhorta puts into place, initially with the Portuguese and then with the Rhodesians. Now, it's worth saying at this stage something about ALCORA, tell you what it was and how it worked. Okay, so Foster is trying to put I told you, that map, the plan for defending Southern Africa he had in mind. And he gives the job to PW Bhorta as his defense minister. He says, okay, here's the plan, go put it into place. So Bhorta decides, okay, remember we want to keep the war up in the north as far away from white guys as you can keep it? And he goes, okay, well, for that, we've got to have the wars in the Portuguese areas. It's got to be in Angola, basically, and in the north of Mozambique. How do we keep the wars going up there? Well, the Portuguese have got to fight the wars. So the South Africans go to the Portuguese with the proposal. They go like, the Americans want your empire to come down. We'll help you keep your empire on. You fight the wars. And the Portuguese turn around and go like, we're a very poor country. We just can't afford these wars. There's no way we can afford these wars. Not only that, we don't have the skills. We don't have a military that's strong enough to do this. We don't know how to do this. South Africans say, not a problem. Not a problem, dude. We'll pay for your war. And in fact, the South Africans, in the case of Rhodesia, they paid for 50%. In the case of the Portuguese wars, South Africa paid 100% of the Portuguese wars. Everything. Okay? And in addition to paying for those wars, they train the Portuguese guys. They give them the skills. Okay? Now, they set up ALCORA as a way to do that. So they're basically saying to the Portuguese, You call up your young men, put them into battle, so you provide the manpower, we'll do everything else. Okay? And the Portuguese buy into that. So that's what starts ALCORA. The actual fellow who created ALCORA, the person directly responsible, was a man called General Charles Pops Fraser. Now, General Fraser was South Africa's military attaché in Lisbon. And he'd been in Lisbon for a while, and he was like, he developed an amazingly good relationship with the Portuguese. They trusted this guy, absolutely. So Foster realizes, I'm onto something good here. Okay, Portuguese really like this guy. So he says to Fraser, okay, we want to create this alliance with the Portuguese. We want them to basically fight our war for us in Angola and Mozambique. Can you set this thing up? And Fraser gets it right. He's a guy who basically gets the ALCORA alliance negotiated and set up. Okay, and what it's all about is for South Africa to put its plan into place, which is to keep the war up north and the Portuguese fight your wars for you, basically. Okay, and of course that means the white guys down in the south don't even know anything's going on. It's not a problem, it's all good. Okay, so what did the South Africans supply to the Portuguese with the ALCORA deal? Okay, so the first thing is South Africa deployed its air force to Angola. Because the Portuguese, again, you've got to have air cover. Portuguese didn't have air cover. So the South Africans send up to Angola Alouette helicopters, spotter planes, and they also get into training the Portuguese. Okay? Training them how to fly and maintain air support, etc. Secondly, South Africa supplies all ammunition, all the weapons the Portuguese need. That's a lot, because these are very big wars up there. Okay? Free. Portugal doesn't pay a cent. They just send all the stuff up there. Thirdly, if you're fighting a war, you've got to have electronic warfare and intelligence. Portuguese didn't have that. The South Africans deployed their intelligence guys to Angola, and they deployed an electronic warfare unit to kind of know what the hell is going on. Okay, so significant. What the South Africans have, you can see not an insignificant allotment of resources to the Portuguese. So how was ALCORA organized? Okay, this is how ALCORA works. ALCORA starts, remember it starts as a Portuguese-South African thing, and then the Rhodesians come in later, but it works like this. There are really regular meetings between all the defense ministers. They meet at least monthly, sometimes more often. Senior staff officers are regularly meeting with each other. In fact, eventually in ALCORA, the three militaries are working as one. They are planning together, they are working together, they are meeting together all the time at the top level. Secondly, intelligence sharing, very important. Okay, a lot of intelligence sharing. Now, the thing about the intelligence sharing that's really clever about this is where the South Africans got a pretty good deal here. Remember, at this stage, Portugal is a member of NATO. And because Portugal is a member of NATO, Portugal has access to all West European intelligence. Anything the French get, anything the Germans get, anything the Brits get, anything the Canadians get, whatever, it's all handed over to Portugal. Portugal just passes it straight on to Pretoria. And indeed, eventually they pass it on to the Rhodesians as well. That's a big deal. It means you're not blind anymore. Yeah? ALCORA, eventually they set up a full-time intelligence secretariat or organization. So the intelligence systems of the three countries are integrated into one. And interestingly, the intelligence organization that was set up for ALCORA was based in Salisbury. Okay. Fourthly, they set up a joint secretariat, sort of like NATO, if you like. They set up a joint organizational and planning system in Pretoria. So there was an ALCORA secretariat where permanent, staffed by full-time military dudes doing the planning in Pretoria. Okay, so you can see it wasn't a small-scale operation. It was a big deal. Okay. Okay, so there you have what Foster does. Not an insignificant amount of stuff he gets, but it's all kept under wraps. Okay, none of us knew this stuff was going on. All right, now, let's now unpack the story of how, because now what happens is, for this to happen, there's the story of how Rhodesia effectively becomes linked to South Africa. From the mid-60s onwards, Rhodesia and South Africa couple up as one unit, effectively, by the end. Okay.
Excuse me,
Yep.
before you go, you're missing something there.
Am I?
No, you wouldn't know about it. I think it's covered in that headline, and there was a very significant development by Foster, which was really given up, as you mentioned,
Yep.
very little airplane. That was the Rhodesians had no wheels, they had no transport. Zero.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll give you the number. we gifted them a vehicle package in 1974 August, which was, and I'll give you the exact number of vehicles, was 1,373, with a value at that stage of 50 million rand South African, or 60 million US. And that was Vorster.
Yeah, no, you see, there was, the amount of stuff that was sent up was staggering. I mean, it was just cost the South African taxpayer a lot. I mean, they were serious. They were serious about keeping Rhodesia going. Okay. Interestingly enough, Vorster never actually said this, but PW Bhorta, as his defense minister, went on record as saying, the Rhodesians are our cousins, we have to help them. Okay. So they weren't mucking around. Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's, and I mean, throughout the war, they were sending trucks. At the end of the war, I remember as well, because I was in the army in the 80s, and by then all the Rhodesian trucks had been blown up, and they had to send them more, and they were looking for drivers. So they came and said, anybody have a license? Right, you're driving a truck up to Rhodesia, off you go. And again, they just kept supplying.
But Eric, there is an important element here that I think you should like perhaps refer to. Vorster was a different animal from Bhorta.
Oh, absolutely.
But you must also remember that Vorster was the reluctant prime minister.
Oh, of course.
I don't think it's a job he wanted. He was Minister of Justice, as I recall.
Yeah, no, he didn't enjoy this at all.
So when Verwoerd got assassinated in September 1966, it was going to be Vorster whether he liked it or not. And that's why I think he followed his own path, which was almost a zero path, because he wasn't prepared for the job. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, and I agree. And you saw it. I mean, and of course, Peter Bhorta was a stronger guy, which is why he stepped into the breach. I mean, he was that kind of guy. So.
The animosity started in September 66 between Vorster and Bhorta, because you're quite right. Bhorta wanted that position,
sure.
And Vorster got the nod because of Hendrik van der Berg, who was head of security.
Yeah. And of course, and later on, I mean, that becomes they really. I mean, Bhorta really hurts those guys when he can. Okay, politicians play rough. Okay, all right. So now what happens is you see how Rhodesia and South Africa intermesh. They couple together. Okay. Now, in order for Rhodesia to become coupled to South Africa, now this happens from the 60s onwards. By the end, Rhodesia is operating more or less as a fifth province. I mean, the way they link them together. In order for South Africa to couple up to South Africa, it has to be decoupled from something, and Rhodesia had to be decoupled from the north. Okay. So, in fact, what we see from the mid 60s onwards is that it's exactly reversing all the policy decisions of the 1950s Rhodesia and Iceland. It just literally turns it on its head. All right. Now, the Federation, we're going to look a little bit now at the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland because it's part of the story here. Why does the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland couple to the north? Okay, why did the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland get created in the first place? Now, the Federation is created basically because the British government are pushing the Rhodesians really hard to decouple from South Africa from 1948. So when the Nats win the election in South Africa, the Brits say to the Rhodesians, you've got to decouple from South Africa. Now, South Africa, of course, I mean, Rhodesia was, up until then, very much coupled to South Africa. Cecil Rhodes creates Rhodesia basically as an extension of the Cape Colony. And we even have the same laws. He just takes all the Cape Colony laws and moves them up to Rhodesia. We're part of South Africa, for God's sakes. Right? The Brits in 1948 say to the Rhodesians, we want you to decouple from South Africa. These are bad guys now. Okay? And they start pushing very hard. And in order to do that, they create the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland. So it's a British desired plan, if you like. And what they want the Federation to do is to couple itself to the British Empire to the north. So the two places they're particularly keen on Rhodesia coupling to is northern Rhodesia and Kenya. Particularly Kenya, because that's Nairobi's the kind of heart of the British Empire in East Africa. Okay? And this is precisely, in fact, what happens. Okay? Now, you might ask yourself then, why? I've just told you that the Brits want the Federation really badly, and they push for it very hard. Why? Okay, so now we have to go back to the other part that I was telling you earlier, which is the thing about the American Empire. 1945, Washington takes over from London. All right? And when Washington takes over, when the Pax Americana takes over from 1945 onwards, the British Empire is told by the Americans, you have to decolonize. But it goes like this. They make a kind of, this fluidity here, if you like. So they make all European empires decolonize everything in Asia, everything in the Middle East. The Americans want them out of the Middle East. They want them out of Asia. Just get the hell out of there now. But it's not the same in Africa. So what happens is, initially, so basically from 1948 till 1958, that period, the Americans say to the Europeans, you can keep your African empires. Get rid of all the rest, but you can keep your African empires. But you can keep your African empires on condition. And they set conditions. There are 4 conditions that the Americans set. So the first was, okay, you can keep your empires, but you have to start immediately reforming the governments of all of your colonies in Africa, away from segregation toward democracy. Remember, the Brits invent segregation. They run the whole of the empire in Africa using segregation. And the Americans said, that's got to go. You're replacing segregation and you're moving toward democracy as quickly as you can. Secondly, you've got to end tariffs, because at this stage, the British Empire is locking the Americans out of trading in Africa, and they're pretty pissed off about it. They say, you can keep your empire in Africa, but we're allowed in. We can trade. No tariffs against us. That is the second condition. Third condition, they say, we want you guys to develop your African colonies. Seriously develop your African colonies. Remember, they want them to give independence to these guys, and they say, okay, we understand the Brits have explained to us you guys have got a problem. You're going to fix your problem, and fixing the problem means development. You've got to start training your black guys. You've got to educate them. You've got to teach them how to run democracies. You've got to teach them how to run countries. You've got to teach them how to run economies, because in the not too distant future, you're handing power over to them. So start developing now. Okay? And in fact, if we look at how it affected us in Rhodesia, that's why you had Kariba. Kariba was it must have been one of the biggest development projects the British Empire ever ran. And it was driven by the Americans. They were saying, fix up that place. Develop it, develop the economy, jack up, train black guys to do shit. And so Kariba was a massive development project designed to change the economies of northern and southern Rhodesia. As part of this program of, you can see what the Americans do. It's quite clever, okay? You Brits invest billions and billions of pounds in Africa to develop these places. It's your money. When the economy is booming, we're allowed in there because you've lifted tariffs to us, and we're going to go and trade and make lots of money. It's smart, isn't it? So the Brits pay and we reap the rewards. Okay. Okay. The fourth thing they do is they say, this is the fourth condition. They say you're working toward independence. Understand, we're letting you stay in the empire for now in Africa, but it's not permanent. You're not there forever. We're just allowing you to develop the place and kind of teach black dudes how to do this. But eventually you're out of there. You're going to shut your empire down. And as I say, I've never been able to find the dates. The Brits sort of talk about a century. The Americans seem to be talking about 30 years. There we go. Okay. Now, that's the American model in the 50s. It's like, yes, you British guys can keep your empire in Africa. 1958, they flick a switch and it just changes like that. Boom. And they change their mind rapidly. 1958, America turns around to all of the empires in Africa and they say, sorry dudes, we've changed our mind, out of here, now. And they seem to give them 4 years. They gave them until 1964. So all of the European countries in Africa were told, you're out of here by 1964. And the reason this happened, and because that leads, you saw the effect immediately. 1958, that's when the Brits start to dismantle the Federation. Start taking it to pieces. Okay? 1958 then leads on, the Federation goes, and then we declare our UDI. It's directly out of this American decision. Okay. Now, as soon as this happens, from 1958 onwards, when the Brits are told, you've got to get out of there, and you see the decolonization of Africa is really rapid after that. The next 4 or 5 years, it's just boom, like that. Okay, now, what this does is, it means that for the case of us in Rhodesia, it means reorientating all those linkages, okay? Because what the Federation had done was to link Rhodesia to northern Rhodesia and Kenya. Now, you're just reversing the whole thing. You're going to tear those linkages to pieces and start to recouple to South Africa. That's hard. It's hard work doing that. But that's effectively what the policy was all about. Now, initially it was quite slow. This decoupling, recoupling wasn't instantaneous, took a bit of time. What triggers it, what actually gets it going, is in 1966. Okay, 1966, the ANC and ZAPU form an alliance. Remember, they're both Soviet-aligned groups. Soviets trying to get them to work together. In 1966, they get them to work together. And in 1966, the ANC and ZAPU form an actual military alliance. And they agree they're going to train their guys together, literally, and operate as an interoperable unit, one military force, right? Which is obviously a terrifying thing for South Africans and Rhodesians, okay? Okay.
Sorry, Eric, why did the Americans change their mind?
Okay, Russia, the Soviets. So the Soviets were moving into Africa and Asia. And to the 1950s, throughout the 1950s, the Soviets were doing incredibly well on the public relations front, shall we say. They were deploying their people into Africa and Asia, and wherever they went, Africans and Asians preferred Soviets, and they preferred communism to Americans and capitalism. And the Americans basically shut themselves. They went, my God, we're going to lose the Cold War. We're in big trouble. Commies are winning. And they tracked it back and they said, we think this is because of this empire, and it's African empire is part of the problem. In other words, the Soviets could say, you see the Americans back empires, they back colonialism, they back these white racist bastards, you know the story, okay? And so the Americans go, okay, you're bad for us. No, sorry, it's over now, out.
But Eric, where does the American budget in South America, in Cuba, in Southeast Asia, they were getting hammered all over.
Everywhere. No, the whole world, I mean, exactly. It's not just Africa.
Why would Africa form a big part? Because they were battling in South America. They had Cuba on their doorstep.
Yep.
Vietnam was busy happening.
They were losing the Cold War for sure. Everywhere.
So why would they take it out on?
Well, it so happened that they had allowed the British and the French and the Belgians to continue running the place, right? In terms of global propaganda. Okay, there was a conference, I think, in 1955. I think it was at Bandung in Indonesia. The Indonesians hosted this huge conference, which was an anti-colonial conference, and they invited all the guys from all over the third world to go to this conference. There was also another one of these in Accra. In Nkrumah hosted a conference too. There was one in Bandung in Indonesia. There was another one in Ghana. And at these conferences, of course, so the Indonesian guy plus Nkrumah, and then NASA got into the act as well. And they're pointing the finger at the Americans going, you support colonialism, you support these dudes, you support the South Africans, you support the Rhodesians, you run your own empires. This is bad shit. You're just bad guy. And so the Americans, they got scared. They chickened out, as simple as that. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what happened.
Because there's also the rise of nationalism on an unprecedented scale, started by the Japanese.
Well, it's a funny kind of nationalism. I mean, if you look at the nationalism that's rising, in Africa in particular, and NASA's driving it. NASA and Nkrumah are very important in driving this stuff. It's a nationalism, but it's nationalism it's Marxist nationalism. It's a funny mixture. It's a funny mixture of Marxism and nationalism. It's not a regular nationalism. It's kind of it's both. And that's what scares the hell out of the Americans. They see this and they see it rising and growing everywhere. And so they go, well, that's how we're going to... I mean, it didn't stop it. Obviously it didn't stop it, but the Americans at the time... these things are always personal. They also appointed a new guy whose name I can't remember now. There was a new guy who was he was the head of the Africa desk at the State Department, and he seemed to be quite a wormy little dude. And he was scared. He went, better make these people go away or something. That's what happened. Changed their policy. Okay. Anyway, okay. All right, so now... let's move on to... Right. Now what triggers it is this alliance between ZAPU and the ANC. So they merge, effectively they merge Mkhonto Wisizwe, their military wing, with ZAPU's military wing, which is ZIPRA. So MK and ZIPRA, one unit, working together. 1967, it happens. August 1967, MK and ZIPRA deploy people into Rhodesia together. So they send a terrorist group of 80 terrorists across the border. So you can see some of you haven't heard this before, many of you have heard this, we've talked about this wanky operation before. Okay, so they cross the border of the Batonka Gorge, and the plan that they have is they're going to head together to Wankie, and at Wankie they're going to divide into two teams. So the Rhodesian guys, the ZIPRA guys, they're heading east toward the Midlands, and they were planning to set up a terrorist base to run a guerrilla war in the Midlands from their base in those tribal trust lands over there. The South Africans were going to keep heading south. South Africans were going to keep marching through Wankie, through Madadiland, get to the Limpopo and cross into the Northern Transvaal and start their war. Okay, that was the plan. On MK's side, MK's planning was that they wanted to see that line that I ran through there. They were investigating how to turn that into a permanent, what they called Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was to be a permanent route where they were going to move their people from Zambia to South Africa on a permanent basis to run the war in South Africa. Okay, so as soon as they cross the border, they get found at Wankie. This triggers the Rhodesian operation called Operation Nickel. Okay, and Operation Nickel basically nails all these guys eventually. But now the significant thing about this is, of the 80 terrorists that cross into Rhodesia, 56 of them are South Africans. 56 MK trained terrorists, Soviets have trained. So when the Rhodesians start to nail these guys and arrest them, they're discovering lots of South Africans. So they get hold of Pretoria and they go, hey, we've got you guys here. There seems to be a lot of South Africans here. South Africa actually got quite a shock. They immediately, once this happened, the South Africans, they got into action, and they triggered in South Africa something called Operation Chinaman. So Operation Chinaman was the Rhodesian. The Rhodesian response was Operation Nickel, South African response Operation Chinaman. Operation Chinaman was basically where the South Africans sent their army and police intelligence people, sent quite a lot of intelligence people up to Rhodesia to go and find out what the hell is. And Operation Supercharge did the following. The South Africans, that's when they sent the Rhodesians 3 Alouette helicopters, 6 Cessnas, and 2 Dakotas. And they also sent the crews to fly them and the maintenance crews. They basically gave the Rhodesians air cover, effectively. Now, of course, that looks a lot like, it starts to look a little bit like what they've done with the Portuguese in Angola, because they were just carrying some of it over to Rhodesia now. Okay, now once the South African police were deployed along the Zambezi, naturally, it didn't take long for them to get involved in actual fighting. Okay, so that happens, in fact, in 1968 already. 1968, Zipra terrorists crossed the border near Chirundu, and this was South African. They got the tripwire line. They find these guys across the border. Tell the Rhodesians. This triggers for the Rhodesians Operation Griffin. So Operation Griffin 1968 is to knock out these Zipra guys that have come across the Chirundu. There's a lot of firefights that happen between Chirundu and Kariba. And eventually they beat these guys. But the significant thing about Operation Griffin is it's the first time the South Africans and the Rhodesians fight together. They're part of the same team now. So in Operation Griffin, you have the South African police, the RLI, and the RAR all operating together to fight Zipra. And during this Operation Griffin, this is when South Africa took its first casualty. So in Operation Griffin, 1 South African policeman was killed.